Chapter 4. The Abduction. It was Saturday, August 20th, and Maurice had driven to the train station in Grenada, Mississippi, to pick up Dad, Wheeler, and Bobo. I was so excited that I didn't know what to do. I kept my eyes on the road looking for their arrival in Dad's 1946 Ford sedan. Dark Fair Road was gravel, and you could see cars approaching at least a mile away from the dust that would be billowing up from behind. Finally they arrived, Maurice parking the car in the front yard. While Dad could drive, he often deferred to someone else. Dad was the first to exit the car. When Bobo got out, his size was the first thing I noticed. He was quite big for a 14-year-old. He must have weighed about 140 pounds and was a little over 5'6". At 12, I weighed about 90 pounds and was just 5 feet tall. You could say that he was chubby, with big, round hazel eyes and sandy hair. He was wearing what we called a Sunday hat, a little out of place on the farm, khaki pants, and a short-sleeved cotton shirt. His shirt was not like the nylon shirts we wore, you know, the ones you can see your undershirt through. There was something else that caught my eye. He had on a silver ring with the initials LT on it, his father's initials. I admired it so much that Bobo let me wear it for a couple of days. I was later able to identify that same ring that was taken off Bobo's body. On Sunday, Bobo wanted to go up to Money to buy some fireworks. You could buy fireworks in town at any time of the year. Maurice drove us there, and Bobo bought some fireworks from Mr. Wolf's, one of 5 stores in the small town. I thought that we were going to go back home and then set them off. To our dismay, Bobo lit some of the firecrackers in front of the store. I told him that you could not set off firecrackers within the city limits. He wasn't trying to be funny, he just didn't know the rules. The next day was the start of the cotton harvest on our sharecropper farm. It was a typically bright Mississippi morning, when the August ground is blistering hot hours before breakfast is even served. There was general excitement around our house, not just because this was the first day of the harvest but also because Bobo was with us. Bobo had kept me up the night before, telling me all kinds of stories and describing what it was like in Chicago now that the weather was changing. I enjoyed the sound of his voice. When Bobo talked, he stuttered, and more so when he got excited, but he used that to capture your attention. I asked him what he would be doing at home if he hadn't come to visit us. He said he would probably be having fun with his other friends up there. Summers in Chicago, he told me, were wonderful, and he really enjoyed going to Lincoln Park, where there were rides, picnics, swimming, and a variety of other outdoor events. I fell asleep that night and dreamed of Chicago and playing in the park with Bobo and his friends. We were aroused from slumber by the sound of my father's whistling. This was a sure sign that he was in a good mood and eager to get the harvesting underway. He had finished the last of his early chores just as we gulped down the last of our grits, eggs, and bacon. A few minutes earlier he had placed a fresh bucket of milk on the side porch, so we knew he had just milked the cows. Before that task he usually fed the dozen or so squealing hogs and watered the chickens. With each completed chore his whistling got louder. And then there was the whistle for us to make it snappy. "Let's go, boys." Dad had a saying, let's go back, the work ain't hard and the man ain't mean. We've got a long day in front of us, he told us as we snatched up our sacks and tucked a few biscuits in our pockets. This cotton picking business would be a new ordeal for Bobo. Only after he pleaded with my father were he and Wheeler allowed to join us picking the cotton. These 2 city boys thought it would be fun. If they only knew, I thought, suppressing a chuckle. I knew the cotton field as well as the back of my hand, a hand, I might add, that had been picking the bolls since I was very young. I was 8 years old when I began dragging a 7-foot sack through the fields behind me. At age 12 you were given a 9-footer. It wasn't an unusual practice for cotton pickers to throw dirt and rocks into their sacks to make them heavier, particularly at the end of the day, when it was time to weigh them to see how much money you had coming. This surely goes back to slavery times, when captive Africans used all sorts of tricks to outwit their tormentors. But we would not dare do that with Dad's cotton. That day, when Bobo and Wheeler were given 9-foot-long sacks to fill, the expression on their faces suddenly changed. A little bit of a smile returned when my father told them they could keep all the money they made. The pay was $2 per 100 pounds, which wasn't exactly city-type money, but it was something. Earning money didn't seem necessary for Bobo. He seemed always to have a pocket full of change, given to him mainly by his grandparents and great-grandparents. He was an only child, so he was showered with affection and money. The way he dressed reflected his good fortune and upbringing. While the rest of us wore overalls and blue jeans, Bobo wore dress pants or khaki trousers, and that silver ring of his. He was a sight to see in the cotton field, dressed like he was on his way to a party. He even had a pair of penny loafers, which was unheard of in the black neighborhood. To the rest of us who had to run errands and do other jobs for a nickel or two, money seemed to be at Bobo's disposal. Around 10:30 that first morning, the sun lingered above us. Sweat began to pour down Bobo's face. I could tell that this wasn't his kind of work. After plucking the cotton bolls from 3 or 4 rows of the spiky vine, Bobo's pace became slower and slower. At the rate he was going, I knew it would take a couple of hours before his sack would show any bulge of cotton. That evening, after his first day in the field, Bobo told my mother, "Aunt Lizzie, it's too hot, and I can't stand the heat." My mother passed this on to my father, who permitted him to hang up his cotton sack and officially retire from the task. Of course, I was not allowed such mercy. That was only available to out-of-town guests and favorite cousins. It was Monday evening, August 22, 1955. After we had supper, we kids decided to visit friends who lived along Dark Fear Road. About 10 of us assembled near the East Money Church of God in Christ, about a mile from our house. A couple of the boys were from the O'Neill plantation. One of them had a gun. As we were talking and hanging out, up drove a 17-year-old black boy named Fletcher and a friend. When Fletcher, who lived on Mr. Carter's place just south of Money, heard about the gun, he threatened to take it from whoever had it. Suddenly there was silence. The only thing you could hear were crickets and a few frogs croaking. No one dared speak up, and Fletcher's challenge went unheeded. Fletcher wasn't a big fellow, but he was mean as a snake. Also, he drove a tractor for Mr. Carter, and because of this job he felt that he could do anything he wanted to another black and get away with it. I asked my friend at the last school reunion whatever happened to Fletcher. He told me that Fletcher was serving time at Parchman Farm, the notorious Mississippi State Prison. Bobo was stunned by everyone's inability to stand up to Fletcher. Because he was an outsider, he didn't feel a need to say anything at the time, but after it was over, he let us have it. From his perspective, we had no backbone. Under a bluff from a bully, we had tucked tail and run. I've never forgotten how upset he was with us, particularly me, who was his flesh and blood. "How can you let someone come on your turf and strut his stuff?" he snapped. "You can't allow anyone to come around and disrespect you like that. We would never tolerate this in Chicago. What are you, a bunch of chickens?" This was Bobo's personality: no one is to strut his stuff on your turf. Rule number 1, you cover the ground that you stand on. Like his clothing, it set him apart from the rest of us. I can still see him standing there now, with his soft, sandy hair and big hazel-colored eyes, and hear him express his dismay at us. He was always looking for ways to make us laugh, but in this case he wanted us to cover the ground we stood on, as he would do in Chicago. I believe if he had lived, he would have been a great comedian. He knew the routines of all the top ones on television: Red Skelton, Jack Benny, Abbott, and Costello, and George Gobel. Gobel, with his deadpan delivery, was a particular favorite of Bobo's. And it was that George Gobel expression he had on his face as he chastised us for our cowardice. I could hear the spunk in his voice, an attitude of defiance and boldness that was not easy for me or any of us to express. Growing up in racist Mississippi, our voices had been muted. There was the unwritten rule of the plantation, at least for good workers: if you stay out of the grave, I will keep you out of the jail. We had seen too often the brutal outcome for those who dared to speak out. Our place in the world was second class, and silence in the face of danger was expected. After he finished bawling us out and calling us all kind of names, there was nothing else for us to do but go home and get a good night's sleep. The next day, Tuesday, Bobo stayed home from the cotton fields, weary but wiser after his one-day baptismal in one of the South's oldest and most laborious activities. He was lucky but had nothing to do that day. He was so glad when we got home that evening. Since it had been boring for him, when we finished supper, he was eager for all of us to pile into the car and drive around. My brother Maurice was behind the wheel with the rest of us, me, Bobo, Wheeler, and my other brother Robert, talking and making as much noise as the engine. Someone, I don't remember who, came up with the idea of raiding a watermelon patch not too far from the county road. Maurice parked the car and we crept in. Each of us borrowed a good-sized melon and headed down to the riverbank. We busted the melons, dug out the hearts, and began our feast. The heart of the watermelon was the sweetest and biggest section. It stuck up like a hill rising from the plain. If you cut the watermelon, you would cut the heart in half. By busting it, the heart stays attached to one of the half sections. Bobo was clearly enjoying himself. We Mississippi boys wanted very much for our cousins from up north to have a good time. He was very impressed with our swimming routine. We would run the snakes out of the water before we entered. On Wednesday, August 24th, there was no change in the routine. Bobo stayed home with my mother, while the rest of us grabbed our sacks and headed for the cotton patch. When we returned from another hard day in the field, Bobo again was jubilant. That day it had taken us a little longer because of the slowness at the cotton sack weighing. But now, with the day behind us and dusk settling in, we all sat down to a scrumptious meal, exchanging stories about our time spent apart. Once more, to satisfy a restless Bobo, we were going to go out. We decided to drive up to Money again. Again, Maurice was driving the old Ford, with Wheeler in the front seat along with one of our neighbors. I was in the back seat with Bobo and another neighbor. My brother Robert wasn't with us this time. The six of us kept up a steady stream of chatter all the way into town. The sun had just about disappeared over the horizon as we pulled into Money. When we arrived, we went directly to Bryant's grocery store. It and the other 4 storefronts in town faced the east, and behind them ran the muddy Tallahatchie River. The name of the river is from the Choctaw Indian word meaning rock of waters. I remember it as a turbulent, menacing river with a strong current. It was too dangerous to swim in, so we always kept our distance. As we reached Bryant's store, we continued our usual small talk and banter. We were still excited about the day's events and happy to be in town together. We all got out of the car and were milling around in the front of the store when Wheeler went in to buy a pop or some candy. Bobo went in after him, then Wheeler came out, leaving Bobo in there alone. Maurice immediately sent me into the store to be with Bobo. He was concerned about Bobo being in the store alone because of what had happened on the previous Sunday, when Bobo had set his fireworks off inside the city limits. He just didn't know the Mississippi rules, and Maurice felt that someone should be with Bobo at all times. For less than a minute he was in the store alone with Carolyn Bryant, the white woman working at the cash register. What he said, if anything, before I came in I don't know. While I was in the store, Bobo did nothing inappropriate. He didn't grab Mrs. Bryant, nor did he put his arms around her. That was the story she later told to the court. A counter separated the customers from the store clerk. Bobo would have had to jump over it to get to Mrs. Bryant. Bobo didn't ask her for a date or call her baby. There was no lecherous conversation between them. And after a few minutes he paid for his items and we left the store together. We had been outside the store only a few seconds when Mrs. Bryant came out behind us, heading straight to her car. As she walked, Bobo whistled at her. I think he wanted to get a laugh out of us or something. He was always joking around, and it was hard to tell when he was serious. It was a loud wolf whistle, a big city wee-wee. And it caught us all by surprise. We all looked at each other, realizing that Bobo had violated a long-standing unwritten law, a social taboo about conduct between blacks and whites in the South. Suddenly we felt we were in danger, and we stared at each other, all with the same expression of fear and panic. Like a group of boys who had thrown a rock through somebody's window, we ran to the car. Bobo, with a slight limp from the polio he'd contracted as a child, ran along with us, but not as panic-stricken as we were. After seeing our fright, it did slowly dawn on him that he had done something wrong. In our rush to get away, someone dropped a lit cigarette in the car. Maurice stopped and was determined to find the smoldering cigarette before pulling out of Money. We all got out and found it pretty quick, then jumped back into the car and sped out of town just as fast as we could. We were about 2 miles down the road when Maurice, in his rearview mirror, saw a car speeding behind us. He brought it to our attention, and we all thought that maybe we were being chased. Maurice hit the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. Everybody got out and ran but me. The rest of them had a head start and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to catch up with them or I would get separated from them. I scooted down in the backseat while they hurried off through the cotton field. The car soon passed by. It was only some neighbor on his way home. When the rest of them saw that nothing had happened, they got back into the car and we resumed our drive toward home. Please don't tell your father I whistled at that lady, Bobo pleaded. He was afraid that if my father found out about what he had done, he would be sent back to Chicago immediately. We didn't want that to happen, so we promised to keep quiet for Bobo's sake. It never occurred to me that Bobo would be killed for whistling at a white woman. I thought he might be whipped if he were caught, but never murdered. If I had told Dad, he would have done one of two things. Either he would have taken Bobo back to the store and made him apologize to Mrs. Bryant, or he would have sent Bobo home as soon as possible. Either way, perhaps Bobo would be alive today. It was dark now, and after Maurice dropped our neighbors off, he drove the rest of us home. We went to bed without saying anything at all about the incident. Bobo's indiscretion was our secret. At daybreak we were all up and ready for the cotton patch, having almost forgotten the events of the day before. Later that evening, a girl who lived nearby told us she had heard about what happened in Money and that trouble was brewing. "I know the Bryants, and they are not going to forget what happened," she warned us. Her words renewed my panic. But all we did was to hope she wasn't right. Again, I did not sense the true danger Bobo was in. So I kept silent. On Friday nothing happened, so we forgot about the incident again. Our focus was now on our upcoming trip to Greenwood on Saturday. These trips were one of the bright moments in my life on the farm. Greenwood was about 10 miles south of Money and about 13 miles from our house. For us it was like Chicago's Magnificent Mile. All of the farm workers from the surrounding plantations would congregate in Greenwood on a Saturday night. The number of people you'd see was stunning. My primary purpose there was to attend the movies. Of the 3 theaters in Greenwood, the 2 we usually went to were the Dixie Theater and the Walpole Theater. Both showed mostly westerns. If the money was right, I would go to both. But Maurice, Bobo, Wheeler, and our neighbor Roosevelt Crawford, known as Sonnyman, did not have time for a movie. They were looking for girls. So they went their own way into Greenwood. Fortunately, I was able to secure my own ride with Sonnyman's older brother, John Crawford. Robert chose not to join us, preferring to stay home to listen to his favorite radio program, Gunsmoke. The rest of us were excited about the trip. Greenwood was the largest city in our county, LaFleur. It was also the county seat. The most stunning things about the town were the lovely homes, stately mansions with well-manicured lawns. Even today, they are just as beautiful and immaculate as they were back in the 1950s. There was also the general splendor of the trip south by Money Road. Crossing the Yazoo River, we observed City Hall, an ornate white building where most of the town's business took place. On one of the corners was a statue in honor of the sons and daughters of the Confederacy. From here it was only a few minutes to Johnson Street, where all that we needed was within a few blocks. Maurice, Bobo, Wheeler, and Sonnyman walked up and down Johnson Street, looking in the nightclubs and watching the people dance. From there they went over to the Blue Light Tavern on McLaurin Street. This was the violent section of Greenwood, a place that I stayed clear of. After spending a little time in the city, they went to the 4/5 plantation northwest of Greenwood, where there was a house party going on, with gambling and White Lightning, homemade whiskey, 190 proof. They tasted the White Lightning, but girls were not to be found. I think I meanwhile saw a western about a lawman tracking down a bad guy, which I believe starred Randolph Scott. What I remember best about the movie was the lawman riding his horse with the rain pouring down, singing a song that went something like this: "Old Deacon got drunk and he stayed all day in his saddle to pray." I'm sure the lawman caught his man. After the movies, I got some food. One of the treats we looked forward to was an ice cream cone and 50 cents worth of fish, or the famous foot-long hot dog. Then I, too, walked around on Johnson Street, people watching. A night in Greenwood was exhausting. I always fell asleep during the ride home. We arrived home after midnight. We had not been in bed 2 hours when we were startled awake. According to Dad, he woke up after hearing a voice coming from the front porch. A man called out, "Preacher, preacher." Upon hearing the voice, Dad said, he got up and went to see who was calling him. He asked, "Who is it?" And the man responded, "This is Mr. Bryant. I want to talk to you and that boy." When he opened the door, he saw 2 white men standing on the porch. One of them, J. W. Milam, we would learn later, was tall, thick-set, and balding. He had a gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The second man was almost as tall but not as heavy. He was the one who had spoken, Roy Bryant. A third man stood behind Bryant, hiding his face from Dad. Dad believed he was a black man, someone who knew us. The white men entered the house through our front guest room, where Wheeler and Maurice were sleeping. Dad woke Wheeler up first. Milam told Dad that Wheeler was not the boy he was looking for, he was looking for the fat boy from Chicago. Then I heard loud talking in my bedroom. In my half-conscious state, I had no idea what was going on. Was I dreaming? Or was it a nightmare? Why were these white men in our bedroom at this hour? I rubbed my eyes and then shielded them, trying to see beyond the glare of the flashlight. The balding man ordered me to go back to sleep. Dad had to shake Bobo for quite a while to wake him up. When he finally awoke, the balding man told Bobo to get up and put his clothes on. It was then that I realized they had come to take him away. It wasn't clear to me what was going on and why they wanted just him. At first I thought they had come to send him back to Chicago, but that didn't make sense at all. I was lying there, frozen stiff and not moving, when my mother rushed into the room. She began pleading with the men not to take Bobo. I could hear the fear in her voice. She broke into a mixture of pleas and tears as she practically prayed for Bobo, asking the men not to harm him. The men ignored her, urging Bobo to hurry up and get dressed. He was still somewhat groggy and rubbing his eyes, but he quickly obeyed. My mother then offered them some money to not take Bobo away. I was now fully awake but still not moving. It was now crystal clear to me that these men were up to no good. They had come for Bobo, and no amount of begging, pleading, or payment was going to stop them. Although Dad had 2 shotguns in his closet, the 12-gauge and a .410, he never tried to get to them. If Dad had made a break for his guns, none of us would be alive today. I believe Milam and Bryant were prepared to kill us all at the slightest provocation. I am glad that Dad didn't do anything to put us all in danger. Suddenly, the same panic I had felt after Bobo had whistled at Mrs. Bryant returned, and it was all I could do to stop trembling with fear, realizing that Bobo was not only in trouble but in grave danger. My fear soon escalated into terror, and I was still frozen stiff in my bed, unable to move or to say anything. My mother's pleas continued as the men pushed the now-dressed Bobo from the room. Bobo left that room without saying one word. There is no way I could have done that. Everyone along Darkview Road would have heard my screams. At the time I didn't know what happened next, but according to my dad, the men took Bobo out to a car or a truck that was waiting in the darkness. One of the men asked someone inside the vehicle if this was the right boy, and Dad said he heard a woman's voice respond that it was. Then the men drove off with Bobo, toward money. Dad stood for a long while, he said, looking in that direction. As for Mama, once the men were gone, she frantically ran next door to ask our white neighbors for help. When the man of the house, who was the straw boss of our farm, refused to offer any assistance, it only compounded my mother's hysteria. She was completely mortified at his refusal to help. I must have stayed in the bed for hours, petrified. Wheeler and I were both awake, but we did not make a sound. Maurice, Robert, and my nephew Curtis, who had just come to stay with us that night after spending the week with his aunt, slept through the whole ordeal. There was nothing the rest of us could do but to wait and pray that Bobo was going to be all right. For a long time we were all quiet together, hoping that the men had only come to frighten Bobo and that he would soon be brought back to the house. Each time I heard a car on the road, I waited to see if it was the men bringing him back. The only thing that penetrated the silence was my mother's voice, choked with fear. She could not be consoled. "I am not going to stay in this house another night," my mother told Daddy. In order to calm her down, he agreed to take her to her brother's house for safety. My mother's brother Crosby Smith lived in Sumner, which was about 25 miles north of Money. This is the same little town that my mother's parents had moved to in the early 1900s. After my mother left our house on Darkview Road, she never set foot in it again. After taking Mom to Uncle Crosby's house, Daddy drove with Uncle Crosby around Money, looking for the men and Bobo. Then, as the sun came up on the morning of August 28, Dad went to the home of Albert Parker, Wheeler's uncle, to make arrangements to get Wheeler out of Mississippi. Dad knew that Mr. Albert had another brother who lived in Duck Hill, Mississippi, which was 15 miles from Winona, the location of the nearest train station. Dad and Mr. Albert took Wheeler to William Parker's home for safety and to see to it that Wheeler got on the next train headed for Chicago. I talked with Mr. William in June 2008, 5 months before he died at 105 years of age, about what had happened that day when Dad showed up with Wheeler. He said he told Dad that Duck Hill was no safer than Money, the whites were killing blacks out there too. Nevertheless, he promised that he would see to Wheeler getting home safely. He said that he had never seen anyone as scared as Wheeler was. What made matters worse for Wheeler was that he had missed the week's last scheduled train to Chicago and had to wait until Monday to leave Mississippi. When Maurice, Robert, and Curtis awoke and learned what had happened to Bobo, they shook their heads in shock and horror. But all we could do while Daddy was gone was to continue to wait and hope. After Daddy came back from Duck Hill, he notified George Smith, sheriff of LaFleur County, who sent his deputy out to take our statement about Bobo's abduction. Then it was time to make that dreaded call to Bobo's mother. Daddy felt we could wait no longer, so he sent Curtis up to the boss man's house to use the phone. Curtis called his mother in Chicago, and she relayed his message to Bobo's mother and grandmother. After the deputy sheriff came, it seemed like everybody in the county knew about Bobo's abduction. Neighbors from all around Money came to visit us, and these visits from friends and neighbors were just what we needed during this very sad time. Many of them offered to help, asking if there was anything they could do to make our lives easier. They provided comfort and food, and we deeply appreciated their help. Curtis stayed around until that evening but then returned to his aunt's house in Greenwood. In a matter of hours, 4 people I had spent time with were no longer at the house. 3 of them, Mom, Curtis, and Wheeler, had left the house willingly, and the other, Bobo, was snatched against his will. August 28, 1955, had been the longest day of my life. It was the first day there was no laughter in our house. And I believe that unless you can laugh and hear laughter there, a house isn't a home. Dad also feared that the house was no longer safe for us, so he sent Robert and me to stay with neighbors, Mr. Clint Lewis and his wife, Gertrude. They owned their property deep in the woods and had 1 son and a niece living with them. We spent 3 nights, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, with the Lewis family. Living with them, however, didn't mean we were freed from working in the cotton fields. That Monday, like clockwork, we were back in the fields, picking the cotton. All the while I was working the fields, my mind never left Bobo, and I was wondering where he was and if he was all right. The hardest part was not knowing what had happened to him. By Monday, Sheriff Smith had arrested Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam and charged them with kidnapping. But there was no news that day or the next about Bobo's whereabouts. On Wednesday, around noon, the deputy sheriff came out to the cotton fields and talked to my father. Dad didn't say anything to us but very quietly left the fields with the deputy. I knew something had happened. I had a feeling then that they had found Bobo. The question in my mind was whether he was alive or dead. The deep sorrow I felt told me the answer. Dad asked our neighbor John Crawford to drive him up to Sumner. He came back that evening with the grim news that Bobo had been found floating in the Tallahatchie River about 20 miles north of where we lived, near the town of Phillip in Tallahatchie County. Dad had seen and identified Bobo. It was devastating news to my family and me. My soul was hurt and my appetite left me again. The day after Bobo's kidnapping I hadn't eaten at all. I don't know how much weight I lost, but my sister Hallie lost 10 pounds in 10 days. My sister Thelma lost her appetite too, for both food and drink. She would take 1 bite and then feel full instantly. We were unable to contain our grief. For the first time in my life, I thought about shooting a gun at another person. I had Milam in mind. I didn't know his name yet, but I remembered his face. Dad sat on the front porch swing, quietly contemplating what he would do next. He would sigh and utter only grunts. Ugh, ugh. Mom was no longer there to console him or to help him understand what had happened. Dad had gone to see Mom at Uncle Crosby's house after identifying Bobo's body. They had decided that for her own safety and peace of mind, Mom should leave Mississippi for Chicago. Tallahatchie County Sheriff H.C. Strider and officials from that county insisted that Dad bury Bobo's body without delay. The undertaker told Dad that the body had to be buried quickly because it was in such bad shape. I never did see Bobo's body. But I did see a picture later, and it was the most grotesque, disfigured image of a human being I had ever seen. That image has lived with me to this day. Dad told them that there was a little church nearby with a cemetery where Bobo could be buried, East Money Church of God in Christ, where he had been the pastor. The same day Bobo's body was found, Uncle Crosby followed the hearse out to the cemetery. 2 young men, Buck Jones, who also lived on Mr. Frederick's plantation, and J.T. Lewis, Gertrude and Clint Lewis's son, dug the grave. We were told to get ready for the funeral, so we left the field, got dressed, and piled into the little Ford sedan with Maurice behind the wheel. The funeral home had made all the arrangements to get Bobo's remains to the gravesite. His body was encased in a wooden box next to the grave. Before the service started, Uncle Crosby told Dad that he didn't think that Bobo's grandmother, Aunt Alma, would want him buried in Mississippi. In fact, he told Dad that Bobo's body would be buried in Chicago. Then the sheriff of LaFleur County showed up, driving a 1955 Ford, and stopped the proceedings. Sheriff Smith told the undertaker that Bobo would not be buried in Mississippi and ordered him to take Bobo's body back to Greenwood and prepare it to be shipped to Chicago. The undertaker told Sheriff Smith that he had instructions from Tallahatchie County to bury Bobo's body immediately. Sheriff Smith let the undertaker know that he was sheriff of LaFleur County and the undertaker was to do what he said. Sheriff Smith got in his car and sped off, spinning his wheels and throwing gravel in our direction. We learned later that Aunt Alma and Bobo's mother, Mamie Till Bradley, had asked Mayor Richard J. Daley of Chicago and Governor William Stratton of Illinois to intercede for them to get Bobo's body returned to Chicago. Uncle Crosby and my mother accompanied the body there. Mom never set foot in Mississippi again. The next day, the rest of us were back in the cotton fields. But our home quickly became a focal point for journalists and the NAACP. Folks from nearby and across the country arrived at the house to talk about politics and other civil rights issues. Of course, Bobo's murder was the main topic of discussion. Dad later said that the NAACP was calling it a lynching, but I remember that Dad often referred to it as a slaying. I had heard of someone being lynched, but slaying was a new word for me. Somehow there seemed to me to be a vast difference between a murder and a slaying. To me, slaying was something committed by a gang of men, a gang that hunts you down like you were a wild animal and without mercy or reason takes your life. In my mind, what happened to Bobo was indeed worse than murder, and I felt that surely something would be done about it. There was a hue and cry from all over the nation, and newspaper after newspaper condemned the vicious killing. Even in Mississippi, many state and local officials denounced the crime. While Governor Hugh White refused to define Bobo's murder as a lynching, he labeled it a straight-out murder, called for a full investigation, and said that the state of Mississippi deplored such conduct on the part of its citizens. These reactions gave me hope that justice would be served and that the murderers would pay for their crime.